The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, an update on breast cancer and the environment, xenoestrogens in the 21st century. I am Michelle Dixon, Program Director of the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, and I want to thank you for joining us. I am very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Deborah Lee Davis. In 1993, Dr. Davis led the team that actually created the term xenoestrogens and was on the first steering committee of the Department of Defense for research of breast cancer. She is an award-winning scientist and author and is founder and president of the Environmental Health Trust. Dr. Davis is currently visiting professor of medicine at the Hebrew University Medical School and lectures at major universities worldwide. She truly has too many accomplishments for me to possibly list here, so I will simply say that we are honored to have her here today. Dr. Davis, welcome.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I want to thank Cheryl Osimo and all of the hardworking women who have done so much for so many with the efforts that you've put into the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition. You really have changed my world and made things much better for women and men around the world. In my talk today, I'm speaking in honor of Leon Bradlow, with whom I have been able to work off and on for more than 30 years, who is a true pioneer in endocrinology and with whom the concept of xenoestrogens was developed in 1993. He's a wonderful scientist and my esteemed mentor. I'm also speaking in honor of Tiffany France, a brave young woman who was diagnosed with breast cancer at age 21 and has become a very important advocate on behalf of all of us. And so I thank each of them and I give this talk in honor of them, and my questions are really, what's the science tell us today? And what are we doing about it? Where's the policy? So Dr. Bradlow has worked with me on the science, and because of Tiffany France, we're able to make some advances on policy. My background you've just heard about. I'm not going to spend any time to tell you much, except to say that I did work at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences for 10 years, so I do understand how hard it is to get scientists to agree on things and how important it is to do scientific research, to do it well, and to take the time to get it right. Having said that, I think at this point we can safely say there is no debate that the environment is a cause of cancer, and this little cartoon based on what the National Cancer Institute reports is that fewer than 1 in 10 cases of breast cancer occurs in a woman who has inherited genetic defects from her mother or her father. So what is the answer becomes a question of unraveling what happens to people after they're born, or, as we know from the work of Mary Wolfe and Gwen Coleman and others at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, prenatal exposures are also important so that they can have an effect that does not result in a genetic defect, but can nonetheless have an epigenetic effect so that offspring that are exposed prenatally will have increased risks of breast cancer on occasion as well, and that those factors are important. Now, what we do know about the germline or the inherited risk is fascinating from work that was done in Sweden and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2005. They looked at the chromosomes from identical twins who come from one egg that splits into two. So 2 boys, 2 girls. In this case, of course, 2 girls. And you can see chromosomes 1, 3, and 12. What the patterns here are showing you are methylation patterns. And these light up, and you can see that the identical twins look pretty close to identical, although there are differences you can already see on chromosome 3 between these 3-year-old identical twins. However, by the time they are 50 years old, their chromosomes don't even look like they belong to the same person, let alone that they would be identical. Look again at the differences between chromosome 1 and 17, 12, and 3, and you see that there are very different patterns there of methylation. Now the question is why? They came from the same egg, they have the same inherited properties. However, something's happened, and what we can say, as I've said often, is that the environment is important because genes give us the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. And it's those things that happen to us prior to conception, during prenatal growth, and throughout life that play a major role in whether or not we will be developing cancer. Now, among the other facts that are relevant here is that if you are an adopted child, your risk of breast cancer is that of the family in which you are raised and not the parents, the biological parents that conceived you. And those, again, are data developed from Sweden, where they have very good studies on such a thing. We also know that people who move from one country to another, for example, women who move from South Asia to the United States, within 1 or 2 generations, thanks to the work of Regina Ziegler and others, will develop the risk of their new country as opposed to the risk of the country from which they came. And this is particularly important because Chinese women have very low breast cancer rates generally, except we are seeing that modern Chinese women who grow up in cities are developing much higher rates of breast cancer today than their mothers or grandmothers did. So we are seeing patterns of breast cancer that are unexplained and vary geographically, vary with people's diet, and of course with what they work with, because workers are in fact one of the most important groups for us to study. And now we do have more data on breast cancer in workers, although for years we were lacking that. Now, when we ask what evidence we have to look at for understanding the causes of cancer, we can look at wildlife and case studies. I will not discuss here in any detail. We can look at toxicology, which, as you all understand, is experiments conducted with animals and cell cultures, both in vivo, in whole animals, and in vitro, looking at cells from animals or humans. And we can look at human studies, and human studies are kind of challenging because we don't and can't subject people to experiments. They have been outlawed, and yet we are conducting experiments today, particularly on our children, with respect to a number of exposures that are taking place that we know are problematic. So because human studies are limited and because they take such a long time to do, we must rely on models to predict what will happen and prevent it from happening. Epidemiology only confirms the past. It's important to realize this. It cannot predict the future. Toxicology tries to predict the future in order to prevent damage. Insisting on proof of human harm and asking what's the evidence that the plume from the Air Force Base is affecting breast cancer patterns on Cape Cod is effectively treating people like lab rats in an experiment with no controls. Asking for proof that cell phones cause brain cancer now means you're condemning an entire generation to being in an experiment right now that they may not wish to participate in if they knew they were part of an experiment. Now, with respect to the toxicological evidence on cancer, the Silent Spring Institute has done a masterful job of reviewing, assembling, and updating their database on mammary carcinogens. We know that the breast is chiefly fat, but we often forget that fat has been called a natural hazardous waste site. That is because fat attracts lipophilic materials, and lipophilic materials will be accumulating in fat. So we must be aware that the breast has no protection, if you will, and as it's developing, particularly prior to development, it's a particularly vulnerable time, so that exposures to young girls, prepubescent girls, have been documented by some of the research supported by the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences to be very important determinants of subsequent development of breast cancer risk. I think the argument about fat being a store for lipophilic organochlorines and other materials has been clearly established by the work of Mary Wolf and others at Mount Sinai, who have done detailed work on what is in that fat. And we know that older women who will have had longer lives and have eaten more foods that contain these things will have higher levels in their fat than younger women. Now, when it comes to how breast cancer occurs, Dr. Bradlow and I developed a theory of bifunctional paths to breast cancer. That is to say, you can get breast cancer from either changing the structure of DNA and how it would work, or the function of the enzymes that influence DNA repair and damage. And all of these factors contribute to the total amount of sex hormone binding globulin that is circulating within a woman. So if we look at the risk factors for breast cancer indicated on this slide, what we know is this: the earlier a girl begins to menstruate, the later a woman enters menopause, the greater the body fat prior to menopause, if a woman has no children, and her lifetime exposure to xenoestrogens. The word comes from the Greek word xeno, meaning foreign agents that enter the body and act like estrogens. All of those together combine to affect the total amount of unbound sex hormone binding globulin. We can use this diagram here to symbolize what goes on. You've got good estrogens, the ones that are the 16 alpha are the bad estrogens, and the 2-hydroxyestrone are the good estrogens. They bind with a receptor like a lock on a key. If the bad estrogen binds, it then turns on the estrogen receptors. They speed up cell growth, damage the cells that are growing, and can lead to cancer. If the good estrogens bind with receptors, such as those that are found in foods containing polyphenols and DIM, the cruciferous vegetable, broccoli, cauliflower, and the like, those good estrogens can bind with receptor, and that can lead to the development of antioxidants, which reduce and scavenge up the free radicals and repair damage and lead to less cell growth. So this is the fundamental hypothesis that Dr. Bradlow and I had developed in a series of papers that have been the foundation for a number of studies that are now underway. And I'm thrilled to see that the Silent Spring Institute is still continuing its important and good work, now collaborating, looking at flame retardants in drinking water as well. What we must know about animal carcinogens is that although we are different from mice and rats, we are not that different. We differ, frankly, by fewer than 1% of our genes. That's been one of the astonishing revelations of this research that's been done on the human and animal genome. And so it's important for us to understand that every single compound that we know for sure causes it in humans, because we have looked back and have enough data on it, also produces it in animals when adequately studied. And as a result, any animal carcinogen should be treated as though it can cause cancer in humans. That is in an IBM Think magazine. That is in the preamble to the World Health Organization International Agency for Research on Cancer as well. These are just some of the agents that we know can cause cancer in animals that are found in tobacco smoke and engine exhausts and the byproducts of e-cigarettes. Many of these same things can be found in all of those. Mammary carcinogens. They are benzene, which is also found in gasoline and still is available, unfortunately, in as some of the products that are being used for wood stripping and things of that sort. They are the nitrosamines, which are nitrate compounds that are emanated, and they can be extremely toxic and cause a number of forms of cancer, including breast cancer. And they are aliphatic compounds like acrylonitrile and butadiene, which are still used in production today. But in the United States, our production processes are much more mechanized and much less involving individual workers. And so as a consequence, we have less exposure per worker in the United States than at any point in history. But that's for the country as a whole. When you look at specific factories, however, exposures can still be very high. And when you look at specific jobs, such as auto repair and brake repair and painters, their risks to some of these exposures remain high and are not well studied because most of them work, particularly painters, as small business people and don't get into any data set that we might be looking at because they're not in a factory. Now, the Silent Spring Institute has a database of mammary carcinogens, and this graph comes from the 2007 paper Ruth Ann Rudell wrote with Julia Brody and others. And it's interesting to see that if you see the breakdown in terms of chemicals, they're almost entirely chemical agents and very little on physical agents such as radiation, including non-ionizing radiation. Now, I'd like to explain to you, you understand that radiation for X-rays, of course, is dangerous, and we have great safety precautions in the use of that radiation. We now know, thanks to the work of the Institute of Medicine, that women should be reducing their exposure to CT scans, particularly prior to menopause, and that the growth of CT scans is a serious problem. But I want to show you now that there's another form of radiation we have to be concerned about, and that is non-ionizing electromagnetic fields. Now, this study was done using the same kind of electricity that turns on your light bulbs in Europe. And what it shows, and I want you to pay attention to the shielded line. The shielded line on the curve there that you see is much lower than the unshielded line, shows you that there is many fewer cells. If you look on the axis of the y-axis, it's the cell numbers of cloned estrogen receptor positive MCF7 cells. That's what you're seeing here. How many cells are there after being exposed to tamoxifen? Tamoxifen, as you know, treats breast cancer and works by undermining and effectively killing MCF7 breast cancer cells. When you have a shield in this study, it's blocking the exposure to the same types of electromagnetic fields that you can get from turning on electricity in your homes today. When that electricity is blocked, then you get the reduction in cell growth that you would expect and want to see happening with tamoxifen. When it is not shielded, however, the other lines, you see an increase and you actually see an acceleration in growth so that it is blocking the ability of tamoxifen to grow. It's blocking the ability of tamoxifen to suppress breast cancer cells. This next slide from the same study by Rainer Gergert and Karsten Grunker shows the effect as well in with 100 microtesla and 1.2 microtesla. And you see, again, this reduction in growth. Substantial reduction when you have shielding compared to the difference when you don't have it. So what is going on to interfere with tamoxifen's ability to suppress breast cancer growth? Well, there could be an interaction between exposures to electromagnetic fields and tamoxifen, because there's an interaction between electromagnetic fields and general exposures to chemicals, as this next study shows. This study was a study in whole animals that were exposed prenatally to a known carcinogen, and as well, they were also exposed to radio frequency radiation, also known as microwave radiation. That's right. Your cell phone is a two-way microwave radio. Industry has used the term radio frequency energy to describe what powers the cell phone, but it is in fact a microwave sending and receiving two-way radio. It uses the same frequency as a microwave oven, but a microwave oven, which can boil water in about a minute, uses 1,000 watts of power, and a cell phone uses less than 1 watt. So industry convinced the regulators back in the early 1990s that there was no need for any safety testing on cell phones because the exposure was so weak in power, and that was correct, and it still is weak in power. But as I show in my other talks available on our website at ehtrust.org, we know that the impact of the cell phone does not come from its power, but from the irregular nature of the signal, which goes like this. It's constantly changing the pulse of the microwave radiation, which is very weak, but it's the constant change in the pulse that we believe is responsible for the results that you see here, and I will explain them now. What you see here is the controls with the black box on the right. These are hepatocellular carcinomas. Don't grow very much. Then you see the carcinogen with the controls, and you see there is growth. This is a known carcinogen, ENU, which is known to increase the growth of liver cells, and you can see it has increased the growth over the controls approximately 3-fold. However, when you add to this the exposure to the chemical carcinogen plus a very low level of microwave radiation, lower than the cell phone, you see that you increase the growth of the liver cells almost double or more than what you get with the carcinogen alone. Microwave radiation, weak microwave radiation like that permitted now from a cell phone, can double the toxicity of a known carcinogen. That's a very important finding, because all of the work that we have done, that Silent Spring and others have done, has been on chemicals alone. And now we have massive exposures to non-ionizing radiation, to our children in schools, to ourselves, to all of you who have a phone in your pocket now. Take it out, because by the time I finish this talk, you will understand why you should never keep a phone next to your body, as manufacturers actually advise. And when we finish, perhaps I can explain that more. Now, what's wrong with waiting for human studies? As I said, epidemiology proves the past. It cannot tell you anything about the future. What we can do is we can look at trends and compare different ethnic and racial groups. We can also look for biomarkers and genetic analyses, such as what I showed you with the twins and other work. We can also take a snapshot cross-sectionally and compare people who are high and low exposed to benzene or vinyl chloride or other volatile chemicals or cell phone radiation. Or finally, we can do a case control study, which is probably the best study, the most expensive to do, takes the longest to do, and most problematic because there are always problems in how we pull those studies off. So just as an example of the things we can learn from epidemiology, this is just a cross-sectional look more than 15 years ago of the rates of breast cancer in the Americas. And what you see here is the US, Canada, and Argentina are at the top of the death rate for breast cancer. And I ask, could this be because we are also leading in meat consumption? It's a question I don't know the answer to. We need to find it out. We can also look at differences between race and ethnicity, and I know you've had previous speakers talk about this. We know that Black women will have higher death rate than white women from breast cancer. And the chances of dying of breast cancer are even higher for Hispanic women, who have the lowest incidence rate compared to blacks or whites, but have a death rate which is many times more their incidence rate than it is for whites. And that is because of cultural factors as well as access to care. And that's something that I know you've spent some time on in the past, but I want to just say this is an example of what you can learn from these comparisons of rates. Now, what we know from looking at twins is that most cancer is not inherited. We know that inherited factors, according to studies of these identical twins, are shared and account for about 27% of risk, and therefore they conclude that environmental factors play a major role in determining breast cancer risk. Let's look at what the factors are that we know about. We talked briefly earlier: menses, late menopause, early life radiation, particularly before breasts are fully developed. A family history, of course, is important. Late or no pregnancy. Alcohol consumption is consistently identified as a risk factor, and lack of exercise has more recently been identified as a risk factor, along with obesity. So all of these things, as I said, are linked by, they increase the total amount of unbound steroid hormone binding globulin. That's a common link between most of these known risk factors. Now, if we look at the environmental risks that have been identified in human studies, meaning that we have enough time and enough data, often on workers, we find that for farmers and others, pesticides have been linked to certain types of pesticides have been linked to breast cancer. Certainly from solvents, that work has advanced substantially. Metals, we certainly know about cadmium, and I think other metalloestrogens need to be looked at as well, and paints and plastics. And they also may all work by increasing the total amount of unbound hormones. As an example of the benzene risk, this is a very sad story shared with me by my colleague Deborah Axelrod from NYU, one of the world's top breast surgeons and a wonderful human being. This woman came to her, having come from Russia, where she worked in Russia with a hood. And she assumed that because she was working in the United States without a hood, that they had better conditions somehow. Well, she was wrong. And she developed a tumor with no other risk factors after working in the United States for 15 years with fumes that turned out to, in fact, contain benzene that she had not appreciated. Now, the Institute of Medicine, understanding the importance of early exposures to radiation, has issued a report that says we've got to advise women not to have a CT scan unless it's absolutely necessary, because the radiation doses, a single CT scan can be equivalent to 200 to 1,000 chest x-rays, depending on the length of the scan and how the instrument is adjusted. That's a single CT scan. And that is why the Institute of Medicine has issued a recommendation to avoid unnecessary CT scans. We see here, I believe, evidence of the increasing effect of CT scans and chemicals on the risk of developing breast cancer at different ages for carriers of BRCA1. That is, they've inherited the gene. Those born before 1940 have about 1/2 of the risk of those born after 1940 by the time they reach age 40, 50, or 60. And these are from data from Mary Claire King from Science Magazine from 2003. This is as strong an indication as we can get of the role of the environment. These women are all carriers, but by age 60, those who were born before 1940 have twice as much breast cancer as those who were born before. Now, secondhand smoke, as you know from other talks you've had, is a risk factor for breast cancer, but especially in younger women. And these are pooled data from a meta-analysis, and I'm going to just show you the bar graph because I want to get to the rest of my talk, and I'm mindful of the time. But these 14 studies were combined, and here's what they showed. These are all the studies, and you see that the postmenopausal on the right, there's not that much of a risk evident for secondhand smoke exposure if the exposure started postmenopausally. But where the exposure started premenopausally, there's a clear and consistent increased risk. And it's a substantial risk in some of the studies as well. So it's hard to study people. We can't tell you everything we've been exposed to. How much tetramethyl chicken fat did you have? We certainly can't control, nor are we aware of our prenatal exposures. So if we look at current residues in our bodies, except for heavy metals, and try to figure out their role for the cancers that we have now, it's often very misleading because of the storage and metabolism that takes place of toxic compounds. So it's like we're looking for our keys under the lamppost because the light is good there, but we know that it was 10 years earlier where we really lost them, and we don't have any data on that. So what we need to do is pay attention to what we have in the human data. As I've indicated, those exposures, these professions are clearly at increased risk. Those who work with those solvents, like benzene and others that we talked about, the nurses and dentists, painters and hairdressers, they are at increased risk of breast cancer. These epidemiologic studies, I won't have time to go to in detail, but I will make my slides available to you for later review. All of these studies have identified risks, and in some cases, in studies of China, the risks are very high, 14-fold increased risk for doctors who are exposed to a variety of chemicals in China in the 1980s, obviously, when the study was done. The exposures took place in the 1960s and 70s, and the results were analyzed in the 1980s. And that is the fundamental problem in epidemiology. We are analyzing the past. We are not able to predict the future. Here's another study on cadmium, and cadmium is very interesting because it does interfere with melatonin, and I believe that that is the common link that connects those things that chemically affect breast cancer and non-ionizing radiation, because they both interfere with melatonin production by suppressing it. This case control study found that women with higher urinary levels of creatinine-adjusted cadmium had a doubled risk of breast cancer. And remember, it's the metals that you can study with epidemiologic residues at this time, but it's very difficult to study the volatile materials. Now, here is evidence that non-ionizing radiation, microwave radiation, can damage the cell line, the cell wall, and in this case, the blood-brain barrier, permeability. These are studies done by Dr. Leif Salford and Henrietta Nitby, and first done by Alan Frey in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences in 1975, showing that the barrier that protects the brain gets breached by RF radiation, so that chemicals that you are exposed to when you are holding your phone to your head and have previously been using Shout laundry detergent or formaldehyde containing nail polish that isn't properly labeled, any chemical still in your body can get deeply into your brain and into every cell of your body if you are being exposed closely to microwave radiation. And these exposures are, in this study, were like a cell phone. They were not high exposures. You get a synergistic effect then between chemicals and non-ionizing radiation. And we know this because non-ionizing radiation is being used to treat cancer by increasing the uptake of chemotherapy agents into the body. specifically into the brain. And there are markers of changes from exposure to non-ionizing radiation that look just like the markers that we identify for carcinogenesis. Increased free radicals and increased heat shock protein, increased cellular or genetic mutations. So electromagnetic fields, I will share with you today, do affect breast cancer risk. And there are two grounds for saying, as I said at the beginning, we have the toxicological studies and we have some epidemiologic studies. The toxicology was first done, that I know of, in the late 1990s, showing the inhibition of melatonin with MCF7 cells and the ability to disrupt tamoxifen, which I just showed you now. Epidemiologic studies you may not be aware of are cross-sectional studies that find that blind women have half the risk of breast cancer of sighted women. Blind women have half the levels of melatonin of sighted women. Melatonin is what we produce when we sleep at night. It's produced in the pineal gland, and it is a powerful antioxidant that can repair damage throughout the body. There are receptors for melatonin throughout the body. And women who work at night also have lower melatonin because they don't sleep at night, and they have an increased risk of breast cancer. So if we look at data you've previously seen from the comparative toxicogenomics database, we need to add to this very elegantly developed schemata by Carolyn Mattingly. We have to add EMF and RF. We've got to include those chemical gene RF interactions to understand what's going on broadly now. Here's some of the real world data. This is a picture given to me by a renowned photographer, and he says it's very widespread throughout Latin America for young women to put the phone in their bra, to their breasts, and as a sign of their maturity and their growth. This is what we know now from studies done by Dr. John West and colleagues in California. Young women who have kept the phone in their bra develop tumors right under where the antennas of their phones were. And remember, fat, of course, if you put it in a microwave oven, cooks very nicely. This is not cooking the breast. This is working through a non-thermal effect. And we now have 3 cases aged 21, and the first in the world to speak out was Tiffany France, in whose honor I am giving this talk today. She spoke out about it. This is an example, however, of a case report that we got from a Chinese American woman. Remember, I said Chinese American women normally have very low rates of breast cancer. This woman was an avid runner who used the phone 4 hours a day for 10 years, and she developed the tumors right under where she kept her phone. This is a MRI showing with contrast imaging where the tumor is, and you see that L form there on the what looks to you to be the right breast but is in fact the left, is the shape of the antennas of that phone that was kept there. This is a 21-year-old. And I will show you just very briefly this, because I think it's an eye-opener, Canadian Broadcasting Corp Public Investigation.
This is why she argues phones should be tested the way we wear them. So what happens when they are? So the tests are all done.
Tests are all finished.
And?
The number exceeded the limit. It went up significantly with each one of the phones.
That's right. The phones exceeded the safety limit when they were moved right against the body. The radiation absorbed increased 3 to 4 times.
Okay, 3 to 4 times more radiation than the test limits allow. That's why Environmental Health Trust is delighted to be invited to talk with you about this important issue, because it's one that most people are not aware of. And we have these brochures available on our website, which we would love to share with all of you. You can go to our website, download and print them, put your own logos on them, and contact us if you want more information. We have a lot of information. There is no question that a phone doesn't belong in the bra. And in fact, inside your phone, there's safety advice telling you this. Now, I wanted to share this just as a, you know, there's a lot of skepticism about, especially in the government today, want to wait and see. And this, I think, is a perfect cartoon that expresses that concerns. Now, what do we do? Okay, these are some of the things you know to do, and Silent Spring Institute and the Massachusetts Breast Coalition are full of excellent advice. I felt I had to include some of this. You all, I believe, if you're online now, this is not new to you, except to limit the use of cordless and cell phones, and not to keep a cell phone in your bra or body. The movie Thank You for Smoking, I couldn't resist using this because those of you may remember, it's about a guy who's has a tough job, which is to promote smoking. And he's has a hard time with it. But at the end of the movie, there's a new line, because there's a new recruit to this business of how do you promote problematic products. And he says these words, "Gentlemen, I want you to practice these words in front of the mirror. Although we are constantly exploring the subject, currently there is no direct evidence that links cell phone usage to brain cancer." Direct evidence, that means dead bodies. That means epidemiology. Now, I'm an epidemiologist, so I want to see more studies, but I don't want to see more of this. By the way, these are the breast scars of Audrey Martin, my dear belated friend. And this poster was in San Francisco, and it was taken down, banned in San Francisco. Kind of amazing, right? We don't want any more of that. We are obsessed with breasts, and we know that we need to protect them. And now I want you to be aware there is a new risk that we need to pay attention to, in addition to the excellent work that we've done on chemicals. Audrey Martin contained 59 cancer-causing industrial chemicals. She did not die of her breast cancer. She died of a brain cancer, and she was one of the earliest users of a cell phone. Now, can I prove that her brain cancer was caused by her cell phone? Not yet, but I think I can, actually. And that's a subject for another talk. These are the fine print warnings that used to be. When I first issued my book in 2010, the book called Disconnect: The Truth About Cell Phone Radiation, this is what the fine print warnings looked like. Yes, you can't read them. That was the whole point. And this is what they said. They said, keep the phone off the body. And they told you how far away to keep it, 5/8 of an inch. But even that is very misleading, because when the phone is on the body, it violates its own standards. That's the point of the CBC investigation. And if we have time, we can talk about the French investigation later. What is happening now, and Environmental Health Trust has been very delighted to play a role with this, is that thanks to Professor Larry Lessig of Harvard Law School and a whole bevy of activists like Ellie Marks and others, Berkeley, California has passed a right to know ordinance that says you have a right to know that if you carry your phone in your pants or shirt pocket or tucked into a bra, you may exceed the federal guidelines for exposure. Well, actually, we can tell you you do exceed it now, because we have even more data than when the law was written, and we first worked on it in 2010. Massachusetts now has 7 bills pending on this issue. And I won't read them, but I will give this to you for your information afterwards. They all are relating to disclosing information about microwave radiation on product packaging and other things. And these bills are all going to be considered by the legislature coming up. What we need now is to organize to support these, as well as the pending legislation on groundwater contaminants that is in the legislature right now. Asking for research is important. Doing something about it is more challenging. I think it's time for us to do something more. And to do that, you can look at our website. You can contact Cecilia Doucette and her information on understanding EMFs indicated here, or of course, the Silent Spring Institute and the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition. I am honored and frankly thrilled to be able to be talking with you all now, although I wish I had more good news to share. Because the problem we have is this: it's a lot easier to find a cure for cancer than it is to prevent it. Because preventing cancer means dealing directly with changes in the food and drug industries, the chemical and pesticide industries, the tobacco industries, and now as well, the telecom industries. There is a policy vacuum. What do? Well, we need what my dear belated friend Bella Abzug called girl cots. Women are responsible for spending most money in this country on consumer products. We can create a market demand for healthier products for our children and ourselves. We've done this with things like Beauty Counter and the Safe Cosmetics campaign. That's been a marvelous success thanks to Stacey Malkin and others. Whether it's cosmetics or cell phones or flame retardant chemicals or routers that go to sleep, information on groundwater pollution, we can organize to create markets to demand this. There's still a lot of work to do. For flame retardants, Arlene Bloom has moved mountains, and now you have the new research that's just been funded with the Silent Spring Institute. But we need an expanded coalition to promote safer technology as well. I leave you with these words. The world is not dangerous because of those who do harm, but because of those who look at it without doing anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. We do have time for a few questions, so if there are questions, please type them in. I do have one that's come in, Dr. Davis. It's really to the heart of how much money is being spent on environmental research.
Well, I can.
And I know that could be a long answer, but I'll
give you a short answer. The budget for the National Toxicology Program has been dropping, adjusted for inflation, since its peak relative to inflation, and its ability to study the number of chemicals studied and the ability to study them has declined. And that's a tragedy for all of us. Now, independent research is minimal because right now so much of research in the environment really depends on federal funding. And as you know, the current federal policies, such as they are, appear to be basically to just slash and drain the capacity to do research. So we're really seeing very dark days in that regard. The National Toxicology Program produced one of the most important studies ever done on the issue of radiofrequency radiation very recently, as well as on glyphosate, which is Roundup, the most widely used pesticide in the United States today. Those two studies took years to produce. They were each reviewed by hundreds of scientists, and the reviews consisted of blinded reviews where a group of pathologists sit around the table and statisticians sit around a different table, and they receive data on chemical A, B, and C, and they don't know which is the control and which has been exposed, and they evaluate it blinded. And those studies go through extensive review before they're released by the National Toxicology Program. And in the case of both glyphosate and cell phone-like radiation, at the level that we can get today, they found significant increases of cancer in those animals. And remember I said every mammary carcinogen that can cause cancer in animals also will produce it in, that causes cancer in humans also will produce it in animals when adequately studied. So we must pay attention to those studies. In the case of the National Toxicology Program, the study on cell phone radiation, which took, unfortunately, 10 years to get done, found the same highly malignant, highly aggressive, rare tumors of the brain in the animals as occur in humans, which we know from epidemiologic studies that I could give you a whole other talk on, clearly do increase the risk of that same tumor in humans, the same tumor that killed my dear friend Audrey Martin, associated with cell phone radiation in epidemiologic studies, is also found in the National Toxicology Program, along with some rare tumors in the heart, tumors of the nerves that go into the heart, very aggressive tumors. And because of that, they issued a partial report on that. It's a final analysis of the brain and heart in those studies saying this is an important problem. And that report has been ignored, completely ignored by the FCC and by the state of California just last night when the Assembly passed a bill to expand 5G throughout California, which will mean thousands of new towers and many thousands of new antennas that will be able to be right at your bedroom window with nobody objecting to it being located on your front lawn of your home, about every 100 yards, the distance of a football field. Completely ignoring the findings that the U.S. National Toxicology Program has said that non-ionizing radiation from cell phones can increase cancer risk in animals and should be regarded very seriously for human health purposes. And there's been no reaction from the U.S. federal government on this at all. And that reaction of silence was during the Obama administration, and I see no reason to think it's going to change now during the Trump administration, although I certainly hope that it would.
I have a question that's come in. What does an individual do to measure or assess their own body's level of toxin?
I don't know that there's any way an individual can do that on his or her own. There are studies that show that eating a diet that is high in antioxidants, high in fiber, particularly cruciferous vegetables, that's broccoli, cauliflower, etc., green tea, polyphenols, that those diets that are higher in fiber and those things literally adsorb and absorb onto the fiber and excrete some of the toxicants that you've been exposed to. But for certain others, such as lead, they are forever, unfortunately. And you can get the levels down, but you have to do that with a physician's help, with chelating agents, and the process itself can be dangerous because the word chelating comes from the Latin word for claw, because it pulls out, literally like a claw, those things that are toxic, but it also can pull out important micronutrients so that they have to be replenished if you do that kind of chelation therapy. So I'm not sure that I know of anything that an individual can do except to sleep in the dark, because melatonin is produced at night, unplug, turn off any blue light, because blue light, which you get from your screen, even though it doesn't look blue, is known to interfere with melatonin. Melatonin, as I indicated, is a powerful, essential antioxidant that is only produced in the dark. So I travel with a sleep mask and recommend, if you live in an area where you somehow have light you can't escape from outside your windows, try to darken your windows, sleep in the dark, eat your broccoli and cruciferous vegetables, exercise. Those are the things we know to tell people to do as individuals. But I really think the questioner should learn more from your website and ours about the things you can do to take care of yourself. And I don't know any way to assess your individual burden.
Okay, thank you. And actually, I have a follow-up on that because you had referenced melatonin. And the question is taking melatonin supplements, is there any data that shows that that is helpful?
Right now, the National Cancer Institute has several clinical trials underway using melatonin to treat breast cancer and I think maybe some other forms of cancer. The problem is the doses needed for therapeutic impact are so high that I'm sure these people have some effects from it. You only take melatonin at night. I don't know of any negative impact except for feeling very sleepy. And I know that it is being studied for its therapeutic properties.
Okay, thank you. Well, Dr. Davis, I can't thank you enough. On behalf of NBCC's Executive Director, Cheryl Osimo, and our Board of Directors, thank you for sharing your knowledge and your passion with us today. I can say that we would love to have you come back and spend more time with us again in the future, and I hope that you will. This has been, no, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I'm sorry. I want to thank you personally, Michelle, because you've been very diligent in setting this up, and I know it's a kind of thankless job. I've looked, and I want to encourage our listeners to look at the archives of the other talks that you have procured in the past. And I want to say I would be delighted to do this again. After I will be going to China, where I'm going to be a visiting professor in the next month. But I will be back in mid-November. And I will be giving thanks for a lot of things. And one of the things I give thanks for is Cheryl Osimo and all of the wonderful women working with the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition. The other thing I want to put in here is a plug for Cece Doucette, who is doing a terrific job on these bills. And I think, if I may say, that when I look at where you've come, you've done so much. It's really impressive to see where the Breast Cancer Coalition has gone, and I really think that Julia Brody and Ruth Ann Rudell have done a remarkable job of marshaling the data. And I think, frankly, when we all began, we thought the only thing we needed was better science. I thought that. That's when I helped to organize, the breast cancer work at the Department of Defense and other things. And I remember Bella Abzug said to me, "Show me the apple." I said, "What?" She said, "We need an apple." I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "You know how we had an apple and people looked at that and apple juice and they understood about the pesticide in apple juice, and women got upset because that was the only thing that could get some of their cranky kids to drink. We need an apple." Well, we don't have an apple. What we have is our lives, our breasts, our bodies, our kids. And I think that we've had a backwards policy in the United States, and it's gone like this. Whenever an environmental issue is raised, people say, "Where's the evidence?" And they want evidence before taking steps. Look at what we've done to climate. Look at the succession of hurricanes still waiting in the South Atlantic to come through to the United States. This is providing the most powerful rejection of the idea that there is no climate change that one could imagine. And it's tragic, because I worked with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the 1990s to predict and we ought to prevent this from happening, but nobody listened. And now we're going to have to deal with the consequences. For breast cancer, we now have, thanks to what you all have done, a lot more science. We do. We still need science. We really do. I'm not anti-science, but I want to encourage you guys at Silent Spring in particular to develop more of a policy arm, to think more programmatically, not just about getting better science, but working with the policymakers. And the only way you're going to get that bill passed in the Massachusetts legislature on the groundwater issue is creating broader coalitions on other issues. Remember what Margaret Mead said: the only thing that ever changes the world really is a small group of concerned citizens. And that's what you are, and that's what I'm honored to work with. And I just really want to say thank you for what you've done. And I hope that we will now together be able to do more on the policy front, because the science is there more than ever. And now we have to move ahead to change the policy so that our kids and grandkids will live in a safer world.
Absolutely. Well, you know that is MBCC's mission, and we appreciate all of your support and your support of our sister organization, Silent Spring Institute. And again, I just have to say thank you, and we'll look forward to having you join us again very soon. Have a safe travel, and to everyone who was listening today, I appreciate you joining us, and have a good afternoon.
And let me say Lashana Tova, Happy New Year to all of those who are celebrating the New Year.